but like everything, Ralph thought if you just worked hard enough, we'd do it better than anybody else. So we were working on this project. I remember going with him to the first meeting of the Grand Challenges in Global Health group for the Gates Foundation in Seattle. And it was a heady experience. The Gates Foundation had like 12 employees, and they had this group of people who had received money. I remember at one point them saying more than 10% of the people in the room had won the Nobel Prize. And Ralph didn't count at that point because he hadn't won. And we had great plans for how we were going to expand and what we were going to do. And things were going really well. And then in 2007, in the spring, Ralph went to a Keystone meeting with his family to go skiing. And he came back and he was bright yellow. And he had jaundice, and that's never a good sign. And he was diagnosed at the time with a grapefruit-sized lesion at the head of his pancreas. He had pancreatic carcinoma. And everything changed in his life, and everything changed in mine as well. So he, Ralph was, though ever an optimist, also a realist, and he knew exactly what that meant. And he, in typical fashion, mobilized everybody to do what we could to use science. The motto of the university is science for the benefit of humanity, and nobody believed that more fully than Ralph. So he organized everybody. He understood that he needed to do all of the conventional therapy that might help. So he was scheduled for a Whipple procedure, which is a huge operation where not only is the pancreas removed, but many of the associated organs. But he wanted to do all that he could. And everybody knew, and we knew, that standard therapy was wanting, to say the least. And so he organized what was effectively like our own little mini Manhattan project of all of the people who were close to him. And that's a huge group. I remember once when I was at the Rare and I was faxing back and forth with Ralph about something, and usually he was very, very, I needed to have it to him yesterday. But for whatever reason, I wanted him to return a manuscript he was reviewing for me, or I don't remember what it was. But I got him on the phone and I said, can you get this back to me because I need to. And he said, don't you understand? I'm supervising the scientific work of 200 people around the globe. Don't bother me about this. And I remember thinking, well, I won't bother you if you don't bother me. But he got it back to me, and of course I turned it around. But he truly was mentoring 200 important scientists around the globe because he was just such a good teacher and good mentor, and people stayed close to him. So that network just mobilized. Everybody wanted to bring whatever they had to help him. So he organized this group, and I, because I'm a pathologist, was in charge of the tissue and procuring the tissue and processing it and how it would get sent to all of the various people who needed it to make dendritic cells, to make xenograft mice, to sequence it, which at that point was a scientific endeavor, not a typical clinical endeavor as it is now, and to preserve the tissue in multiple ways so it would be available as needed into the future. I went with Marina Kasky, who is my dear friend and colleague now, and who's now leading Michelle Nussenzweig's highly neutralizing monoclonal efforts. Our colleagues at Memorial, who were colleagues of mine from the Rockefeller, not from the Rockefeller, from the AFIP, were extremely helpful. But perhaps most importantly, I knew I had been appointed at some point in, I think, 2004 to be an alternate on the IRB, the Institutional Review Board. And I knew that we were going to have to do this in a way that was all approved. We were going to have to cross every T, we were going to have to dot every I, that I didn't want this to be one of those times where people are in the back of the lab cooking stuff up, that anything Ralph got was going to have to be under the supervision of the FDA, under the approval of our IRB. And so I went immediately to Dr. Emil Gottschalk. Dr. Emil Gottschalk was the chair of the IRB at the time. He is also the Lasker Award-winning scientist for inventing the meningococcal vaccine. And he invented the meningococcal vaccine which was subsequently developed. And as I like to say, he's the only person I know who developed a vaccine that's in all of my children. So I went to him to explain what we wanted to do. We wanted to collect the tissue to do immune therapy. Ralph was a believer in an early adopter of immune therapy, and he believed his dendritic cells were going to save him. So he wanted to collect the tissue in such a way that it could be used for immune therapy, and then he wanted to conduct the immune therapy here at the Rockefeller in our little hospital. So I went to Dr. Gottschalk and I explained what was going on, and he was absolutely wonderful. He spent several hours with me going through all of the details of what we needed to do and what I was proposing. And, he said he was very sorry. He would do what he could. I should come back after, certain things had happened. So again, I went back to Ralph. We were organizing all the tissue. At this point, I'd only talked to him about the tissue procurement, which was pretty standard and, he would help me with. Because anything that was procured that we were going to use for research we had to have permission in advance. So he said, he would convene an emergency meeting of the IRB. Harriet Rabb, who was our general counsel at the time, met with me, and we spent hours figuring out, I listened and then did what she told me, what we needed to do in terms of those issues. And then Ralph wanted, I was leaving one of these meetings with him, and I was organizing my papers, and I said to him, Ralph, who's going to treat you? Who do you want to treat you? There were several people who were oncologists. And he said, I was thinking you would do it. And I had been seeing vaccine volunteers in the conduct of the vaccine trials, and I liked that, but I said, I'm not an oncologist, and he, in his inimitable way, said, of course I know that, you're a pathologist. But I think he wanted me to treat him because he knew, first, that I would take care of him, but he also knew I would do what he said, that I was not going to substitute my own scientific judgment for his, because our whole relationship was based on the fact that I had my opinions, but when it came to science, I deferred to him because I really believed his were better and stronger. So that actually led to one of our first arguments. I almost never argued with Ralph, but I told him that yes, I would be honored to do it, but that it would have to be done the way I wanted to do it, in terms of every I dotted, every T crossed, every approval that we needed, that I would work hard and I would get them all, and that I hoped that it would be invisible to him, that he wouldn't see all that, but all of those things needed to be done. And he begrudgingly agreed. He understood why it irritated him. Any sort of paperwork irritated him, but he understood. I went back to Dr. Gottschalk and I explained what had happened and that I wanted to be the one to treat him. And Dr. Gottschalk, in his way, is one of the few people I know who's truly wise, thought about it, and he said, I need to make sure that you really want to be doing this. And that was one of the few times where I actually choked up. And even now, remembering that is a little hard for me. And I thought about it, and he said, I want you to think about it, and I want you to come back tomorrow and tell me. He said, because I need to be sure, I need to protect you, because no matter how hard you work, and no matter how good a job you do, this is not likely to end well. And I thanked him, and I left, and I came back, I assumed the following day, and I said, I really thought about this, and as much as I don't want to do this, if anybody has to, I want to be the one, because I want to have the peace in myself that I did everything that I could, and I want Ralph to know that I did everything that I could. And he said, well, with that, I'll help you. And off we went. And that was the beginning of what were 11 clinical trials that Ralph entered into, 8 of which were conducted here at the Rockefeller. It was impossible to do anything completely new for him because of timing and how long it has to take to be developed. So we worked with colleagues at Harvard, we worked with colleagues at Johns Hopkins, Glenn Drainoff, Liz Jaffe, Carolina Paluca, who was absolutely wonderful, Jacques Bonchereau. Everybody brought what they had to bear, and we filed single patient INDs. They used to be called compassionate use, but now it's called a single patient IND with the FDA. And the FDA was wonderful, You know, people talk about the FDA as being obstructionist. They were wonderful. They cooperated with us. I was on the phone with them in the evening. You know, they are, like us, a group of scientists doing the best they could. And Ralph got his own dendritic cells in 2 forms. He got several different vaccines. And he lived 4.5 years, in addition to all the standard therapy. He lived 4.5 years. He saw his daughter Leslie married. He saw two grandchildren born. 3. Robert, Sila, and Isla. And he won the Lasker Award. And that was a great moment for him. He was so happy. We had a big celebration in the lab. And one of my very favorite moments at that was his mother, Nettie, who was a force to be reckoned with, was in her mid-90s, and she was there celebrating. And the Lasker Award is run in a very, very tight way. The woman who runs it is remarkable. And everybody is only allowed to speak exactly, you know, there's a program of minutes of speaking, and the presenter speaks. The person who wins doesn't typically give a very long talk. They just give a brief acceptance speech. And everybody's told they're not allowed to thank anybody because they don't want it to be like the Academy Awards. But Ralph gave his acceptance speech, and you can see it online. It's wonderful. He's enthusiastic, and he's waving his arms saying he's feeling dendritic. He says, there's one person that he must thank. And everybody knows when you say that at this luncheon, you're not allowed to thank anybody. He said, that's my mother, Nettie Steinman, and she's in the back of the room. She's 96. Would she please get up? And as she got up, and everybody applauded. And he said, you know, she's the person who really allowed me to have my career as it was. She always supported me. So we had a lab party afterwards, and I was sitting with her, and I've known her since I was 17 years old, and I said, you know, I told my 4 boys, note to file, if you win an important award, thank your mother. And she said, well, he should have thanked me because his father wanted him to go into the family clothing business. And I fought with his father, and I argued, didn't fight. I said, let him do what he wants. He had 2 brothers, and he said, the other boys will go into the business. Let Ralph go to medical school. And she made the right call. So unfortunately, Ralph had full faith in his dendritic cells, and he really believed that this was going to be the answer. And he was preparing a case report for the New England Journal of all the things and his immune responses. But sadly, the cancer was smarter. And after 4.5 years, in the summer of 2011, he really took a turn for the worse. And he took a turn for the worse precipitously. The cancer must have mutated. It escaped whatever had been controlling it. And by August of 2011, it was clear he was very sick. He was getting phase 1 chemo at Memorial, a platinum-based regimen that was very, very hard on him. And he was still coming to lab. With all of that, I think he missed 10 days of lab for his Whipple, and that was pretty much it. And even then, he was working from the ICU. He was bemoaning the fact there was no Wi-Fi at the time in the ICU, because wouldn't everybody need to be hooking up on their computer to work? He got much sicker, and we were still trying to get additional immune therapies. He had gotten several antibodies, and we were trying to get additional ones. He was prescient about combining them. The combinations that he wanted to get that were very difficult because the drugs weren't licensed yet are now standard of care for a whole variety of tumors. He really knew what he was doing and had great insight. But he got sicker and sicker. And in September, the end of September, he was home. I went with Christine Trumpfeller and Marina Kasky, who are my close colleagues, to visit him in his apartment. We went over a whole long list of things that he wanted us to do. And I stayed to talk about his immune therapy because that was my job. And I remember thinking, he'll probably be around for Christmas. And that was a Saturday, and I left. And he got very sick that week. He got, on that Sunday, he had a pulmonary embolism, and he ended up in Memorial, an inpatient hospital. And it was clear that there was really nothing to do. And once there was nothing to do, Ralph was done. He was committed to not suffering, and he was done, and this was midweek, I guess. And then on Friday and Saturday were Rosh Hashanah, the Jewish New Year. And so on, I guess, Saturday morning, yeah, so the first day, his daughter called me, his daughter Leslie called me to say that her dad had passed. He had died overnight, peacefully surrounded by his family. And, you know, we were going to have to tell the lab. So at the Rockefeller, when a head of lab passes or retires, the lab is disbanded. And so we were going to have to tell the lab. So I spent the weekend on the phone with Michelle Nussenzweig, who very graciously took everything over and stewarded the lab forward, and Jeff Ravitch, trying to figure out what we were going to do, who we were going to tell. It was very sad. The family didn't want anybody to know because they just wanted privacy. They didn't want to see anybody. And because of the way we work and how intertwined our lives were, once people knew, everybody was going to know. And they also wanted to tell his mother before they told anybody else. Because of the Jewish holiday, they weren't able to get to her. So they basically asked us to wait till Monday to tell everybody, which was our plan.